The next day, John was there again with 2 of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the 2 disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" They said, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. Over the past 2 to 3 years, I have found my head turned and my heart caught by the transformative glimpse of God I have experienced through Christian community. Like the 2 disciples, I have felt this glimpse feed a deeper curiosity, prompting me to follow and ultimately be invited to come and see. To this end, this 2023, I am embarking on a 6-month journey to dwell with various Christian communities. On the way, I'll be sharing interviews with community members, founders, and leaders to learn more about the blessings, challenges, and wisdom these dwelling places of God hold. In doing so, I hope to inform how it is we might nurture people and communities to be transformative manifestations of God, offering a glimpse of the divine and inviting people to come and see God's loving dwelling place.
I am Mim Skinner, author of Been Together and a co-founder of Refuse Community in Chester Street.
It was really interesting reading your approach to community and the fact that you explored such different
yeah, really different.
Community.
I mean, it's I guess a slightly different context in that lots of the things I guess you wouldn't necessarily even call intentional communities. Some of them are co-living, more like commercial movements. But it's a really good journey.
Was it during uni or like post-uni?
Post. So for 7 years after uni, I lived in community. That was a Christian community doing, kind of very close-knit, sharing bug beds and housing people.
Like with friends?
Yeah. We had 6 to 8 of us there, and then we've housed people in emergency accommodation initially. That was a very kind of young, quite frenetic community. And then we moved out of that when I got married, lived on our own for 3 years, and then moved back into a community farm. Although actually that project's come to an end as well now.
Right. Yeah, and because what I was curious about in terms of, it sounded like you had radically open doors in the community that you lived in, like post-uni. Did that always work out?
Oh my gosh, no. And that's why I think it kind of wasn't sustainable, because it worked out for that time in our life when we were really kind of had so few responsibilities and could live in a really, kind of reactive and responsive way, but actually that's not that sustainable long term. And particularly members of our house who, I guess were more introverted or went through periods of ill health, found that a really difficult dynamic during that time. So I don't think necessarily it was, the most nurturing community, but it was effective. There's kind of loads of activism that came out of it, but probably wasn't balanced on completely for being, kind of nurturing and sustainable space.
Yeah, and because in terms of the people that you welcomed in terms of emergency housing, would you just open to anyone, or like how did that happen?
Well, I think it helped that we knew the homeless population really well, because we ran other projects like soup collection, things like that. So we would kind of know, who people were, what kind of needs they had. So we knew the homeless population quite well. So we kind of understood really relationally what some of the risks were. So we tended not to have people who are really long-term homeless.
Yeah.
I mean, we offered sometimes, but that wasn't actually what people needed.
Yeah.
And we did have a number of people who were kind of in active addiction, but again, I think we understood our kind of limit with that and our limit of what we could do. So we kind of supported somebody to withdraw from heroin at one stage and kind of sat with them, through that withdrawal process. But yeah, typically didn't have that many people who were kind of in active addiction living with us. So it was a really kind of interesting space. Sometimes we, didn't have anyone for a while or just had friends of friends. And other times, we had guests with pretty high needs. So it was a very, kind of reactive ebb and flow space.
Yeah. And what prompted that interest in like community living in the first place for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we were, a few of us were interning for churches and we were living up on estate, not with each other necessarily, but nearby. And I think, during that time we were just reading a lot of books, Shane Claiborne's It Was This Revolution. It's like so many people read that at that time and thought, oh my gosh, what could we do?
Very powerful.
It was, and it still is. But and we kind of had an event where people got together, Christians, and kind of shared their dreams for the city and for the county and the region. And there were a few of us who'd shared dreams around, like, what would it look like if we took, Acts 2 really seriously, and what would it look like if we kind of committed to these things. And then, that group became the first set of housemates. And somebody at that event became the landlord. And so it was, kind of, I guess, a few things come together. There were a number of different housemates that changed over that time. But we all still pray together now, and this is sort of a decade later. Two people in that house, and my daughter's godparents, and so it looks really different now. But it's definitely those relationships, maintained.
Yeah, and then what sparked you wanting to visit a whole range of different communities, Christian, non-Christian, co-housing?
It's a good question. I think over the pandemic, I just heard a lot more conversations about how we can live in more connected ways and interdependent ways, and whether the problems were around cost of living or loneliness epidemics or poor mental health, or I guess us being in this kind of neoliberal setup where we were, household consumers and all consuming within these tiny blocks, and not just consuming, but kind of living all of life in small blocks. And for some people that's quite lonely if you're a single person, or maybe you've got kids. So I guess I was hearing more and more of those conversations about how housing wasn't working for people, whether that was kind of economically or socially. And I wanted to find out what the different options were. And that looked like everything from, visiting naturist communities where they was kind of like building a society where you didn't have to wear clothes, all the way to kind of, monastic communities that kind of lived a life of prayer. Like, what can we use our critical mass to do? That was one of the big questions. And if there's enough of us, what systems can we opt out of? And if there's enough of us, what kind of new ways of living can we pilot? So it was just a really exciting year.
Because how long did you spend in each community?
Really, really varied. Some was only a night and some were a week. Communities like the rehabilitation community for drug and alcohol, I visited over quite a long period of time, just going to meetings. I didn't stay there. Completely varied.
Oh, well, that's fascinating. And then you mentioned that you tried to pilot like a community farm project, and how did that go, and kind of what?
Well, we're living there now, actually, and we love it. We really love it. And it means that our daughter's kind of grown up with other people and other kids, and it just didn't have the momentum behind it. Financially and in terms of people power. It's like a massive thing to take on a farm, particularly looking towards like self-sustainability. So we've had an amazing year, but we aren't going to be staying there. The kind of farm's being sold, actually. But so we're living community of sorts now, and we're about to move in with my in-laws.
Okay. Yeah.
But we'll have life that looks for the next section, I guess. More like an individual household. I think we'll live in community again, definitely. I just don't think we know yet what that's going to be and what that's going to look like.
Yeah, because what was the main lesson from the community farm? Because you moved into a larger house with another family? Was it just one other family?
So two other families. Initially we were couples, but then everyone was pregnant when we moved in. Oddly. What's the main lesson for that? I guess probably something about working out what your kind of purpose is as a community before the place. So we kind of had this farm.
Yeah.
That was, a friend of ours farm, and we kind of said, we could do something with this farm. But probably if we've got kind of a wider group of people and then said, how do we want to live? How do we want to interact? Okay, what building can help us do that? That might have given us a bit more momentum.
Yeah.
I think rather than being kind of asset-led, like, we've got this farm, what can we do with it? But actually, there just wasn't the people power behind that to make it work, I guess. So that's kind of one learning. But I mean, I think it's been a bit kind of, moved from pillar to post, but I think we're still glad we tried it.
Yeah. But I think there is more interest in community now, or it seems to be like a common trend, I think, across over time, but there's a sense in which I think people are cottoning on that something isn't quite right always.
Oh, no, I absolutely think, right from through to the commercial sector. I mean, you can't tell everything from investment, but you can tell some things. And actually the kind of communal living sector has been a huge growth area. And there was a study by Savills, the agent, kind of calling it one of the biggest investment areas of the next kind of few years. There's 24,000 beds in the pipeline in the UK alone, for kind of accommodation which recognises social as well as material needs of tenants. So I think there's absolutely that stuff's happening on the kind of fringes of co-living, where people want to live more sustainably, or whether it's tiny house communities or people wanting to kind of gather together in cooperatives, but also it's happening in housing as a sector, looking again at design and what people want to buy when they buy housing. And, typically that's not just a material thing.
Yeah. And did you experience something different between the Christian communities you visited and the non-Christian communities that you visited?
I think the kind of main thing, and actually I would say this probably applies to all the faith communities I visited, Buddhist and Christian, is that there's a kind of external point of reference, and that was really helpful in terms of, making community decisions, is there was some agreed upon external frame of reference. Whereas if, you're just in a, like a kind of hippie 70s community, actually it was quite difficult to have kind of go past an impasse on an issue, because people were coming from really different belief systems. And so it was kind of slightly difficult to, I guess, conclude. So people were kind of, often there were lots of, things that had been brought up at the last 10 community meetings and no one had kind of moved forward on. So absolutely, there was that. I guess also there were a mixture of internal and external, but certainly faith communities, there was always some kind of how are we interacting with the wider community as well as our community. Although actually that can be said of almost even the kind of very commercial ones. That was one of the topics of conversation that often came up, like how do you be, they call it place-based, how can you kind of be not just a company that sits in an area, but interacting with place a lot.
Because you did, in your book, you mentioned this, was it in London, which was very commercial by the sound of it.
And those are the most kind of most common and most growing type of communal home, not just in London, but globally.
Yeah.
And again, it's so different in many ways to Bristol communities.
Yeah.
But also, I think, learn a lot from them. You know, like the earliest communities are religious communities. And some of those things, whether that's around like decision making or values, are carried through into even modern commercial centres, I think.
And it's interesting. So there's like the language of common demanding tasks, which kind of comes up in community language. And I personally find that is an important component in community, or in the communities that I've been a part of. It's really helped to have something that you're working on together as a group. Is that something that you would agree with, Dawn?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think things sort of fell apart in different communities I visited where they didn't have that.
Yeah.
So, there's kind of, even that kind of commercial one you mentioned that's in London, they kind of really came together over, you know, doing a social project together and raising money for an organisation, or doing their whole house did like that. Fundraising run. And that was this kind of point of connection that meant everyone was joined together. And again, I met a Buddhist community in London, which had to disband because they kind of stopped. Yeah, they kind of had their individual faith and they had their meals, but they kind of stopped having, what are we for? What's the purpose of this? And it kind of all fell apart. And the story they told was like, we realized we were in a house share because there wasn't this kind of communal drive. That was something we all did. So absolutely, those are much more successful as communities if there's a goal.
Yeah. And I have another question on that. In the meantime, I have questions about the Refuse Cafe.
Which is where we are.
Yeah. So what's the story behind that?
The Refuse Cafe started out of that first house I mentioned, the one where we were all kind of living together on bunk beds, and we were just raiding dinners to do these community meals because we'd have kind of open house meals. Now we are sitting in the Refuse Cafe. There's a warehouse behind us, and we turn over between 12 and 13 tons a month of
from supermarkets,
retailers, supermarkets, factories. It's absolutely kind of changed in how it runs and what it does from the days we were kind of collecting cabbages in our front room. We used to kind of put a little sign outside that community house saying, you know, take what you want. And it is for me, I find it a really interesting case study of how a community works, because it's a non-monetary economy. Well, not non-monetary, that's just one of the ways you can pay. So we talk a lot about value being a number of different things, and people can pay with their time, skills, in kind, with pledges. And so the kind of framework for participation is different. It's not like where you come in and you're a consumer and your kind of access point is having money and handing it over. And it kind of broadens ways that you can participate, which I find really interesting in terms of the relationships that then fosters, because you're an equal participant if you have, you know, X amount of money or X amount of time or X amount of kind of willingness or energy towards it. And I have seen similar things in churches and similar things in other projects like this, where the kind of the means of access are democratized in some way. But it totally changed how people interact and who interacts with each other and who's allowed to be around the table. And I guess food does that anyway, right? You must have seen this in all different communities, that there's a kind of getting around a table together does way more than the sum of its parts. So that's felt a kind of very special thing. And this is, in a community in and of itself now, I guess, in that we have 200 volunteers that keep it running. And people kind of talk about this being their home or their kind of volunteer family. And that's not anything we've done. That's just people organically interacting in the space. There's no credit to be claimed from that by anyone setting it up. It's just people coming together and taking away some of the barriers, I guess. And kind of really simple thing.
Because it's really evolved since kind of the initial idea. And because in summary, what was the like progression and development of the refuse?
Well, we did pop-up events first in like borrowed church halls and, you know, cafes after they're closed, things like that. And then this building we got 6 years ago, and it was basically a shell. And I think it was 56 different volunteers renovated it, wired it, plastered it, put in walls. And yeah, it's now been open for 5 years. We had our kind of 5-year anniversary last month. And it does all manner of different things now. From schools projects to volunteer schemes, a catering company. It kind of is, again, has some of that very reactive stuff that characterised that community.
And so, were you like working full-time, part-time, or like during all of these like quite activisty things?
Well, initially, yeah, to be honest, working full-time in that I was working in the prison system when we started Refuse. So we just did it evenings and weekends for a while, and then kind of it became a job later. And I think that was the case for lots of us who kind of did it volunteer first.
And that's something I've really seen in terms of communities, is how they kind of start from not much and then they just really grow.
Yeah. And I think, like I said, I think if we lived in community again, almost that organic growth rather than like, oh, we've got a building, let's fill it, would be the motivating factor. Not that we haven't loved living in community this year, but I think you need the history in order to have the momentum. You need a kind of people who started it together and feel committed.
And it feels like you've got real community here in terms of, I know, someone that you're sharing a car with maybe, or someone else with a baby, and someone coming to show you paintings.
Yeah, well, Nikki actually was who I started Refuse with. She and whose car I share. She was in the other bunk bed in that first community house, and she's our daughter's godmother. So definitely there's a kind of that community's ongoing in different ways, whether that's here or just through our own houses. Yeah, kind of sharing space. And we have a kind of weekly meal with that group still, actually.
And I don't know whether you find this, as the people who are really real believers in community, have experienced community, completely see it as a legit way of living and kind of challenging the economic system that we're in. And then a whole bunch of people who just like don't know about community because it's still quite niche, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you get that as well.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a kind of, I think lots of people for whom it would be like a really positive, healthy way of living. But yeah, maybe that'll change. Yeah. We're kind of it's interesting, the kind of people who are having the conversation. I don't think it's that niche anymore.
Yeah, it's definitely growing. And what would you say is the main thing which draws you to community? What is it about community that you believe in?
Yeah, I guess the ability for kind of a collective mass to do something different from the prevailing culture. And like, whether it's a prevailing culture of individualism or consumerism, like there's something about a collective mass. And again, this is what really draws me to kind of the grassroots and activism stuff we do here, is that we can be like, okay, well, if there's enough of us, we can try something different.
And do you think you had a main takeaway from your visiting different countries?
Yeah, good question. So, what was the main takeaway? I guess that this stuff, the world isn't set up now that it has by accident. So if you want to design community, it's got to be intentionally. The world is no longer set up. for us to be really interconnected. There are loads of examples of kind of community assets that have now completely extinct, whether that was like your village oven that everyone went to cook bread, or whether that was the working men's club, which was kind of everybody's front room.
Yeah.
And we don't have those community assets anymore, which make it really natural and really organic. So if we want community, we've got to design it. And the most successful communities that I visited were ones that kind of, were just really intentional and really consistent about creating open spaces, laying out the terms for participation in those in a really explicit way, because it doesn't by accident.
Yeah. Yeah. And what would you want to tell people about community for people who haven't really experienced community or residential community?
I'd want to say that the scope of it's so much broader than you might imagine. And I think people can look at an expression of community, whether that is the kind of self-sustaining hippie communities from the 70s, or whether that is this kind of urban co-living, and you can think, actually it's not really for me, but what it means to live community is just so much broader and so much deeper than that, and it might not be for you, but actually maybe there are kind of other points of resource sharing, for example, that we can all do, whether that's a tools library or a community coffee morning, that create those spaces and are those spaces.
Yeah. And how important would you say the Christian component is to you, and more widely for the sustainability of community?
I mean, for me, all of the communities I've lived in are Christian, and that's been the motivation at each of them. Like we've had, community prayer, and that's helped give it a shape. And I think that'll continue to be the case. We'll always live in Christian communities. It's interesting to see the sector growing and what it means to live in community changing, and in many ways that's a positive thing. And I think we've learned, for better or worse, from Christian communities and from the faith communities more broadly. I think we've seen, particularly over the last decade, some really dysfunctional things around power structures in Christian communities and around colonialism and patriarchy. But also Christian communities remain, from the ones I've visited, the most long-standing, consistent and successful communities. So I think definitely going forward, we will learn, for better and worse, some of these like really, really old, consistent traditions in what it looks like to live communally going forward. I'm not sure what that'll look like yet.
Yeah, because it's interesting comparing monastic communities and communities like the Bruderhof, where you do make a life commitment to the community and they can be sustainable because there is a life commitment. And I find these communities beautiful in the fact that they're one of the rare communities who have care of the elderly built in a way that, in a way that other communities don't. So it's kind of like you have to have the life commitment component to have the care of the elderly component and the sustainability component.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also recognizing that I'm not ready to make a life commitment to any community at this stage.
I've found those communities, just kind of staggering in what they've achieved. But also to kind of be that community, you have to live in some way, to some extent, in isolation from the world around you, because you need to have, I guess, a really strong sense of this set of people is who we are. And there's that deep commitment there. So again, there's loads you can learn from that, but that is going to be the kind of model for everyone. So I think, you can kind of take things from all of those. And certainly visiting the Bruderhof, I felt just so really humbled by how much space is created for people who'd be, not valued in other communities. An amazing space. And again, just completely not for me. It wouldn't suit my personality. I don't think it's one you could kind of roll out across of everyone. I don't think you'd want to, but yeah, there's so much we can all learn about how you value
Thing. And yeah, something I think about a lot is the kind of the elderly component, which I haven't seen built into community yet, other than the lifelong ones and how that can be done.
No, I don't think I have. Actually, no, I don't think I have really. There's some interesting projects in Germany, multi-generational houses, that was interesting, where they had kind of older people and a crash and those kind of things cross-pollinated, but it wasn't, the kind of in-depth care stuff. Yeah. I haven't seen outside of either something like the Breeder Half or a family content. Really inspiring.
I know there are some initiatives where elderly people living alone, sublet to younger people, and there are a few commitments involved in that. But that's very isolated still, and it can be a bit more intense, I guess. And I guess what's really beautiful about the Breedhof is that care is shared out as well.
It really should. Have a look at the Mehrgenerationenhäuser in Germany, because again, that's a model that I found really interesting.
Yeah. Did you visit them?
Yeah. I just did a residential, one of the only residential ones in Stuttgart. But phenomenal place. Like they had over 65s living there, and then crashes and programs for refugees and asylum seekers, and it was just very making sure that each group was valued for what they could give to that context.
Wow. So did you visit more communities than you ended up writing about? Yeah. And what determined what you wrote about?
I guess what bases are already covered. If I felt like, I'd kind of talked about this already in some other way. But, like, for example, there's absolutely loads. I don't know if you've connected with the Diggers and Dreamers.
So I was going to ask, that was a question I wanted to ask. So I was thinking, because I found some communities which aren't on there, and I would love to talk to whoever.
Well, they're keen to have as many on their map as possible. So, add them on if they want to be added. But, they are really, really interesting. I guess that's kind of the fringes of communalism, whether that's sustainable communities or, in some way kind of self-sufficient. But I could have visited 10 of them, and actually they have loads of things in common. So I didn't write about all of the kind of environmental communities that I visited, because they had one of these common elements, really.
Now, I'd love to connect, because you connected with the person who manages it. Is it?
Yeah. So I write a bit for them, James. Yeah, I can put you in an email with him if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great. Because are they based in London or?
Where is James? He's at Tinkers Holland. He lives in a community.
Okay.
I forget which one. But there's like a group of editors who do it, who live in different communities.
Because it's a really good and well-established network of communities.
They really punch above their weight in terms of connecting people. Right. Do you go to their conference?
I didn't, and I see that there's one coming up. I'll already be in America. I was like, damn it.
It's really good. We've actually got to work out if we can go, but I really rate it.
Yeah, and it's so good that there is such a strong network, because in visiting different communities, I was thinking, it's like we need a conference. Like, great, there is a conference. And it would be good, I think, if there was more of a specifically Christian directory, because the spiritual section is quite messed up.
It's quite small.
And there are some which I've come across. Because that's the thing I found. I don't know whether you found this as well, but you visit a community and then people tell you about more communities just by word of mouth. So there's so many that you just don't have a website, but you have to have the exact name to be able to find them. I don't know whether you visited any of the ones in Bristol.
No.
They have an amazing network of Christian community.
What? So I've had some friends that lived in Christian communities in Bristol, and it's so bustling, isn't it? But I think that was the other challenge, is that I wanted a good geographical spread, because if Bristol and Somerset, you could have written a whole book about, but actually we don't all live in Bristol and Somerset.
That's where I'm going next to the Southwest. I'm spending a whole month in the Southwest, giving them face in Durham.
And we kind of need, there's like almost the subcultures are there. And how do you be like, okay, well, it's for everyone. You know, actually part of these really specific subcultures, and where, like hemp and have joss sticks at home. Like, what does it look like if you're an accountant or a middle manager and want to live in community?
Yeah. But that's my next stint, as it were. Yeah. And would you recommend people who are interested to visit different communities? Do you think it was a fruitful time for you in thinking about community?
Yeah, absolutely. And they're so welcoming. Lots of them do woofing. Lots of them do kind of, whether it's kind of other work and stay type stuff, or you can pay to stay there. And it's just so interesting to speak to people who are kind of piloting different ways of living.
Yeah.
So definitely. And Diggers and Dreamers makes it quite easy because you can see who's up having visitors and how they operate, and it's like a tally system.
Yeah. I think I've appreciated having lived experience of community before visiting lots of different communities. I don't know whether you would agree. I think if I hadn't actually lived in community, you wouldn't be able to grasp at it in the same way. But having lived in community, I think it just makes a lot more sense. So you can see things a bit clearly or perceive. Yeah, I think it adds a depth to the way that you can see things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you feel like you have hopes for community at the UK, or are you just kind of more like?
I think so. I'm a bit of an optimist, but I do think something's going to have to give environmentally, financially, in the next decade, and that will look like whether it's the sharing economy and kind of having these points of connection through resource sharing, or whether that is actually living in the same space. I do think that there will have to be more.
Yeah, it's really interesting in your I think it was in Leeds, just about the building regulations, or even New York, the building regulations which prevent community housing, essentially. That was really interesting.
Yeah, really. It's amazing how often that came up as well. It was just very, very common as a...
Yeah, sad.
It's a bit. It's just not... not the norm. But I guess, those things will change eventually. It'll just take enough gaps in the system to need that change.
Yeah, no, it's an exciting world. Sure.
Yeah. It'll be really interesting for you to see what that looks like in the States, how it operates differently.
Yeah, I think the States have actually got a longer, they've got some quite well-established intentional Christian communities, from what I can tell. And I think, and then in Irresistible Revolution, there's a whole list of American communities. Great, there's a directory of American communities, but it's less established for the UK. So I think they've almost been at it longer in a big way. So that will be interesting. And they've got lots of exciting models. I'll be able to explore some of that. But I do want to come back to the UK.
Yeah, of course. And it's interesting to look at, what that looks like with families as well.
Yeah.
Kind of sharing childcare stuff, foster childcare.
Yeah, because I think there's, as you mentioned, there is that stage of being a kind of a younger adult and not having any responsibilities, not necessarily being married, not having family, and being able to do community in quite just going. How is it for you now that you've got a family, and how do you think about community now that you've got a family?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've loved having kids in a communal setting, and being sort of around together, spending time in the house with the other babies or the parents. She's so young, we haven't necessarily got to a stage where we're doing shared childcare just because she's so really dependent on me for meal. So I don't know what that would look like. Again, that's a different phase. Some of the communities I visited, that was really normal, kind of shared childcare. But you can't really do that with an under one as easily.
Because you were pregnant when you were visiting all the communities as well, right?
Really quite pregnant. I had my last visit, probably about 6 weeks before I gave birth. So it was lumbering about a bit towards the end.
Great.
It was enjoyable. It's so much easier to do it when you're pregnant than when you have a baby.
Oh, yeah, fair. Yeah.
Get it in before you are suddenly less mobile.
And as a Christian, would you say that how is it that you've experienced, so I've called this podcast Dwelling Place, just pointing to the fact that it feels like there's something quite special in community and something which points to God. And what would you say wherever you experience God in your kind of community
yeah.
experiences?
That's interesting. I'm probably someone who experiences God in very practical ways. In, you know, less so a kind of, you know, quiet meditation, and more so through kind of conversation, action and food in an almost quite Jewish way, you know, like in Jewish traditions that were around kind of this, you know, eating together or ritual or kind of, you know, washing together.
Yeah.
It's like super practical, isn't it? And definitely I think my faith plays out in similar ways to that. Which, yeah, it's kind of just threaded through community life. Is the kind of God in the practical and in the washing up and kind of, yeah, prayer around the meal table and conversation and welcome, in the very kind of touchable and knowable things, this unknowable God.
I love that, community as God in the practical. I love that. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, that's not theology. I'm sure people will be like, well, that's rubbish. But yeah, I think definitely there's something of Old Testament traditions where the practical outwork of the community was the way people met God. And I think that's underrated, really.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's nearly 2. So I don't want to take too much of the time.
I'll take off.
It's just been great to connect.
Yeah, it's so nice to meet you.
Thank you so much.